All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to our survey research topic. This is particularly important because we've addressed a couple of different research method techniques in this class. However, we will actually be conducting survey research ourselves in this class. So it's about time that we learn a little bit about survey research. So survey research is all about asking questions, and we can ask questions on a variety of topics. We can ask people questions about their behavior, about their opinions or attitudes. We can check their knowledge in different areas to see how educated they are in a particular field. We can ask for people's beliefs. And there are many ways that we can ask these questions. Surveys can be conducted through the telephone, through interviews, through the mail, and most popularly these days, through the internet. So surveying is a great method available to many, many researchers, and there is much that we can learn from survey research. However, our consideration here is we really can't manipulate anything about a person when we give them a survey. So surveys are often not experimental designs and cannot determine causal relationships. So we have a few steps of survey research. The first is coming up with your research design. All right, so when we think about this for our own purposes, the research design is like having a hypothesis, having an introduction to your topic and understanding what variables you'll be assessing using a survey. You'll select a sample. That's already a little bit done for you, right? We'll be sampling other students. And then constructing questions. So that's coming up on our agenda. We're going to want to construct questions for our surveys. Then we ask those questions, get data from them, and then report our results. Right, those are the steps to survey research. So why do a survey? Well, surveys are great for fielding information about individuals. All right, if we give a person a survey, we have a report of whatever behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs we ask them about on our survey. And we can quickly create aggregations of views. And by aggregation, we mean collecting groups of data from different people. Right? We can give out 200 surveys and then split those 200 into different groups, aggregate opinions or beliefs for specific subsamples of our group of interest. Surveys are usually quick to create and to distribute, so they're a great way to study recent and current events, and they're a great way to study large groups. So think of it this way. If we wanted to do an MRI study, getting an MRI done takes at a minimum an hour, right? And you have to go to a location that has an MRI machine. There's a lot of involvement. Where surveys, we can often send surveys directly to people to complete at their own pace, at their own time, at their own location. So surveys are very useful and very widely used for these reasons. So surveys have a variety of uses. They can be used for descriptive, explanatory, or exploratory purposes. So this sort of goes back to our main domains of research methods in psychology. We have descriptive studies, we have correlational studies, and we have experimental studies. So we can do a variety of these methods using surveys. And we collect data that's going to look something like this. I have some examples of the data that we'll be drawing from our surveys to get us an idea of what we'll be working with once we have our data. All right, so why do a survey? All right, well, surveys are important for collecting data on populations that are too large to observe directly. So we've discussed this relationship before, that when we pull samples out of the population, the goal is to be able to make an inference about that sample back to the population. So this is back to our sampling topic in general, and that good sampling methods give us good inferences. So when we're conducting a survey, we want to use careful probability sampling to get a good indicator or a good reflection of what's truly happening within our population of interest. And surveys are helpful in this because they're completely standardized. If you're giving out a survey, you're giving the same survey to everybody. So it's often easier to make inferences back to a population when we have that level of standardization. All right, another main component of survey research is response rate, the percentage of surveys that are returned. And you might imagine, right? I think we can all think of a time when we received a link to a survey or a phone call asking questions that we did not want to participate in. All right, then we would not be part of that response rate, right? We would be considered those who did not respond to a particular survey. But on its face, this doesn't seem like much of an issue. But if we give it a little more thought, there's some danger to considering who might be agreeing to participate in a survey and those who are not agreeing to participate in a survey. And I think a great example of this would be something like an online review. All right, take Amazon or Yelp or these large review platforms. When are you likely to review something? When are you likely to go out of your way to give your opinion on something? The general consensus here is normally if we're very, very satisfied or very, very happy with whatever service or very interested in whatever topic, or the inverse, right? If we feel very strongly in a negative way towards whatever is being surveyed or reviewed. So we always have to consider who has responded to our surveys, because even if we sample well, our response rate might make our sample a little bit more abnormal than we might expect. So I have a little image here from a survey response rate, and it has a 28% response rate. That's completely normal. That's very low, but completely normal. If you send out 100 surveys, you might expect to get 28 responses. But we won't have to worry about that because I'll be using some leverage to get other students to take your surveys, which is the beauty of being at an institution where research is going on, right? It kind of supplements our ability to collect data. All right, so this is where we really want to give some thought when it comes to our studies. So we want to quantify survey responses. Right? So remember, we have two different branches of data. We have qualitative data and quantitative data. We always want to quantify data when we can, because quantifying data makes it easier to use in different forms of analysis. So we might be asking a question, all right, about sleep. All right, this is examples about sleep. If we want to know how well someone's sleeping, we can ask a number of questions. All right, so let's take a look at these here. We can ask how many hours of sleep do you get a night and have them just report how many hours of sleep they're getting. We can create groups or nominal variable where we ask people if they get at least 7 hours of sleep a night. Yes or no. All right, that's very different, right? Different than having number line data of number of hours somebody's sleeping on average per night. You get at least 7 hours a night forces you into one or two categories, yes or no. We can have a scale, right? On a scale of 1 to 6, how satisfied are you with your sleep? Maybe hours of sleep is not the only indicator of sleep quality, right? Maybe you're sleeping plenty of hours but are not very satisfied with the quality of that sleep. Or we can ask without any number values in place. We can range from strongly agree to strongly disagree. In this case, we only have 5 response options. So while these are all getting at the same variable, we're asking them in very different ways. So what I'll have to say here is that when we create our surveys, we want to remain flexible. For example, if you ask people how many hours of sleep they get a night, later you can create 2 groups, those who get more than 7 and those who get less than 7. But if you only ask, do you get at least 7 hours of sleep a night, you're very restricted, right? Because everybody that answers, you don't have any more specific, quantifiable data. So this is just to get us thinking about the different ways that we can ask questions. And remember, we're always leaning towards flexibility. All right, this is a list of response sets for different types of measures. I don't think there's anywhere great to put my head right now. I'll put me up in this corner to only block one. It says always under my head. But response sets for asking people about frequency or quality or intensity or how much they agree or approve of a different topic. So this is to get us thinking. This has the numeric values up top, right? 5 is beneath my head here. But we can always extend these scales. We can create 10-point scales, 7-point scales. But we just want to remember that this will dictate the type of analysis that we can do. All right, so this is where I like to make a big point about our surveys, all right? I want us to keep this in mind when we create our surveys, that we want some diversity of our data. Remember nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio data? Each of them have certain analyses that can only be done on that particular type of data. For example, t-tests, ANOVAs, and chi-square all rely on nominal or categorical data, while correlations rely only on ratio and interval data. And remember that for our purposes, interval and ratio data will be treated pretty much exactly the same, all right, as long as you have equal intervals between your data. So while you're brainstorming and thinking about your survey, you should be thinking about different ways that you can ask the questions that you're interested in asking while receiving diverse data in the process. All right. Another major concern with survey research is what we call non-attitudes. We have a little analogy here that says, many assume survey research is like archaeology, that there's some pre-existing treasure or information and that we need to dig for it, right? We have to use our tools and dig for it. But in psychology, it's not always this clear cut, right? Sometimes people truly don't have attitudes or opinions or education on a certain topic. So considering this here, we've talked a lot about scales and different types of measurement. Here are two scales that are very similar, but with one very notable difference. All right, and the notable difference here is up top, we do not have a neutral or middle option. All right, and on our second scale here, we do have a neutral or undecided or a I don't care, I don't know option. So this is something else we want to consider for our projects, right? Do you want to give people the option to be neutral? And this, of course, will depend on whatever your topic is, right? Sometimes we truly have neutrality when it comes to certain topics. Maybe someone's not educated in the topic that you're asking about, so they're neutral about it. So this will be a decision that you have to make in your surveys. To deal with non-attitudes, first of all, when we're dealing with complex issues, we want to give people a non-attitude option, right? If we're dealing with complex issues that require a fair bit of knowledge, we don't want to force people into having a stance that they really don't have. So sometimes a workaround for that is screening individuals beforehand to see if they have knowledge on the topic. And then your options here are you can offer a middle position or an I don't know position. And then we're also going to build into our studies the option to not respond to a question. So that's another form of us offering non-attitude options for those taking a survey. So this can come in a number of different forms, right? Maybe you want to ask about certain political issues. Maybe some people aren't informed on them. You don't want to force them into having an attitude on something they know nothing about. All right, so what are the strengths of survey research? All right, we've sort of overviewed these so far. We can probe a very large group very easily, all right, that's one of the biggest perks. It's very flexible. All sorts of fields use surveys. We have medical surveys, educational surveys, political surveys, business surveys. They facilitate hypothesis testing. We can do hypothesis testing and probability testing using survey studies. And it encourages standardization and systematic comparison. So I mentioned this previously, that surveys are great because you're giving the same version, the same copy to everybody, right? Everyone that you give it to. And if another researcher wants to continue your line of work, they can take your survey and give it to even more people. Right, so it encourages that standardization across the board. It does have its weaknesses though, survey research. Standardization comes at a price, all right? Maybe some people don't understand your questions very well. Maybe people are not answering in a uniform fashion. Standardization does not leave a lot of room for, say, personal opinion. But rather constricts individuals to selecting based on the response options we've given. Surveys often don't get at why. All right, and I think this is something really important to note. Remember that cause and effect relationships can only be achieved by an experiment in which we have randomized assignment and a control and an experimental group. And we have a whole section of the class devoted to experiments and experimental design that we'll be touching on after this, since we're getting this information now to help with our projects. But surveys often don't get at why. It's considered descriptive, all right? Remember that term descriptive, meaning it just describes data, but often doesn't allow us enough information to make an inference back to the population. Why is also a form of qualitative data. So qualitative data meaning perhaps we want to ask somebody, right, why they're feeling a certain way. All right, we would do this in a psychological setting, a therapeutic setting. You might want to ask somebody why they're feeling a certain way. If you ask somebody why they're feeling a certain way on a survey, you can leave some space for them to write in how they're feeling, but ultimately the goal would be to analyze that data. And it's very hard to take free-form human words and put it into a form that can easily be analyzed, right? It doesn't fit into one of those nice data boxes we've talked about in the class so far. So I like to share an example of the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. Working with children, I used to work on a study where we were looking at trust in children and how they trusted different sources. We had a game that we played with them involving cute little puppets. And we would ask them who they trusted. We would have an inherently helpful puppet and an inherently tricky puppet. And we wanted to see if they could determine which one was being truthful and honest with them. We asked them one of these why questions at the very end of the study. We would ask them, why might someone say something that's wrong? Why might someone say something that's wrong? And as you can imagine, we were working with 3 to 5-year-olds, and their answers for why were very convoluted, right? Pretty hard to understand. So why is hard to get at in any psychological research, but especially hard when we're working with standardized survey research with very little interaction with a researcher. Respondents might not have an opinion. We talked about non-attitudes and how we handle that. Respondents may not actively engage, and you'll probably experience this in some form with your data collection, where someone goes down and just clicks the same option all the way down, right? Or it will have conflicting responses because they're just getting through it as fast as possible for extra credit for a class in some cases. So surveys are often not taken as seriously or as regulated, perhaps, as a study where you're working directly with a researcher. And then lastly, respondents may lie, all right? And they not just may, but they will if you survey enough people. We have something called social desirability, where people will often answer questions, even confidentially, that puts them in a more favorable light. And we see this very often with asking people about their eating habits, about their exercise habits. They'll often say that they're doing perhaps a little bit better than they are. Right, this of course isn't universal, but it is a trend that has been seen in this type of research in the past. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about here is survey sins, things that we do not want to seep into our survey questions. So first we have double-barreled questions. That's asking 2 questions at once, all right? Maybe, do you like reading and writing? All right, maybe somebody likes reading but does not like writing, right? That's double-barreled, asking 2 questions but only asking for 1 response. Bias, all right, we don't want biased questions. Something like, the pollution of our river is absolutely terrible. What do you think about the pollution of our river, right? You're sort of steering somebody in a particular direction. Double negatives. All right, double negatives can confuse in survey questions. And you might be thinking, why would you put a double negative in a question, right? That seems absurd. But oftentimes just the nature of what we're asking about will lend itself to double negative questions. So we always want to avoid that type of language when we can. Categories can be a bit problematic too if we have a select all that apply or select the one that applies to you the most. If you're using categories, they need to be clear and thorough. They need to be mutually exclusive and they need to be exhaustive. All right, so that's if you're trying to put somebody into a single category. All right, and we'll give an example of this in a moment. But if you want to ask somebody, say, what ethnicity they belong to, and you only list 5 ethnicities and no other option, that's not an exhaustive list, right? You're probably not giving everybody an option that they can belong to. Ambiguity, we don't want any ambiguity in our questions. We want them to be very straightforward. Even if we're using deception, as we discussed in ethics, we still want the nature of our questions to be easy to understand. The response option should not be confusing. And then we want good formatting, all right? We have wonderful tools to help us have wonderfully formatted surveys, but a poorly formatted survey can give you poor data, right? If the respondents do not understand the nature of your survey. So I have a couple of examples here of bad questions, all right? These are all bad questions here. So let's take a look. More people have attended the movie Gone with the Wind than any other motion picture produced this century. Have you seen this movie? So this is just a bit of a loaded question, right? If what they really want to know is, have you seen Gone with the Wind? That's all they should ask, right? This other information about how so many people have seen it might bias an individual's response. They might think to themselves, well, maybe I have seen it, right? If everybody else has. So that's not good wording. In your opinion, how would you rate the speed and accuracy of your work? All right, this is double-barreled. Both speed and accuracy shouldn't be measured together, right? Maybe somebody works very quickly but has very low accuracy, right? So this question doesn't encompass that very well. This is an example of categories, right? Maybe asking someone when they first heard about some information and where it was from. So we have a list here from a friend or relative, from your spouse, from a newspaper, at work. This is not a very exhaustive list, right? There's no other option. There's no internet option. There's a lot of other options we could include here, right? So this is certainly not exhaustive in our listing. All right, how do you feel about the following statement? We should not reduce military spending. All right, so not reduce military spending. We could turn this into a question without any double negatives, right? Maybe should we reduce military spending, right? Just make it so the direction of response is simple. All right, that's what we want. We want questions to be very easy to answer. You don't want your respondents or your participants to have to stop and think too much about how to answer a question correctly, right? You want it to be quick and easy to understand. People grow up in all different types of families. What type of family did you grow up in? We have a few options here. This one's just embarrassing, right? Mom is single parent, dad is single parent, both mom and dad. We know there are many more family structures in this. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, foster care, adoptive parents. All right, so this one's no good. We want to make sure we're giving enough options. Where do you get most or all of your information about current events in the nation and the world? This one's also terrible, right? Double-barreled, because maybe you get your information about current events in the nation from a different source than the world, right? There's national news and worldwide news, and not a very exhaustive list here either. And then lastly, we have higher than single family density is acceptable in order to make housing affordable. This is just very vague, right? Very vague. It's not asking you anything specific. What do they mean by acceptable, right? Acceptable for you, acceptable in general. So we want to be more clear than this, right? Your question should be what we call transparent, right? It should be fairly transparent. The question should be easily understood by the participant. All right, so that's our overview of survey research. Again, we will be making surveys in this class, so it's important to understand the general mechanisms behind survey research and how to make a good survey. So make sure that you reference this when you're creating your own survey, and let me know if you have any questions.